They thought they understood the Ottoman Empire, European kings, Balkan lords, Crusader knights. They all convinced themselves that the Turks were merely nomadic horsemen, a frontier power, a threat contained by stone walls and armored cavalry. But they were wrong. Very wrong, because hidden behind the empire's rising crescent, behind the sultans, the palaces, and the thunder of its armies, stood a brotherhood unlike any military force Europe had ever seen. Young, disciplined, subhed, a force bred not from noble lineage, but from children taken, trained, and transformed into the most loyal soldiers the empire would ever command. They were the Janissaries, the shock troops who would shatter kingdoms, topple fortresses, and rewrite the balance of power across 3 continents. And those who underestimated them never underestimated anything again. Because by the time they realized what the Janissaries truly were, the empire had already begun to swallow the world around them. In the early 14th century, warfare was governed by tradition. Medieval Europe still trusted heavily armored knights, the unstoppable charge of noble cavalry. The Byzantines believed in old Roman doctrines, in mercenaries and fortified cities. Balkan lords placed their faith in feudal levies and mountain defenses. Everyone had their certainty. Everyone had their system. Everyone trusted the ways of war handed down across generations. Meanwhile, on the frontiers of Anatolia, the early Ottoman Beylik was still a small force, a tribal principality surrounded by stronger powers, and yet, a transformation was brewing. While their enemies clung to tradition, the Ottomans began experimenting with professionalism. They studied the failures of their rivals. They observed how unreliable tribal warriors could be. They saw how mercenaries, though skilled, fought for pay-not loyalty. And so, early Ottoman rulers asked themselves, what if an army didn't rely on nobles? What if soldiers owed loyalty not to their tribe or clan, but to the Sultan alone? This question would lead to one of the most radical military experiments in world history. To build a loyal army, the Ottomans created the devshirme, a levy on Christian boys taken from the Balkans. It was controversial, it was brutal, but it was effective. From villages in Albania, Serbia, Bosnia, Bulgaria, and Greece, boys between 8 and 18 were selected. Some families resisted, others secretly hoped to be chosen, for the devshirme offered a chance of rising higher than any ordinary villager could dream. These boys were taken far from their birthplaces, converted to Islam, and placed into schools run by the Ottoman state. They were trained in disciplined languages, physical endurance, Islamic theology, military tactics, absolute obedience. Those who showed administrative talent became scribes, diplomats, officials, the backbone of the Ottoman bureaucracy. But those who showed strength, those who demonstrated courage, those who possessed the fire that sultans sought in soldiers, they were sent to the corps that would become the sword of the empire. The Janissaries. The Janissaries were unlike anything in medieval warfare. They were professionals, serving full-time. They were paid salaries, not feudal land grants. They lived in communal barracks, trained daily, drilled relentlessly. They used early firearms, long before Europe fully embraced gunpowder. They fought in disciplined ranks, not chaotic charges. And above all, they answered only to the Sultan. They were his household troops, his bodyguards, his enforcers, his elite. Their very nomenclature, new soldiers, reflected their revolutionary nature. Inside their barracks, the Janissaries lived like monks of war. They trained together. They ate from the same cauldrons. They slept side by side. They marched in perfect unison. Their symbol, the cauldron, represented unity. Whoever tried to overthrow the cauldron was seen as betraying the entire brotherhood. Even their music, the pounding drums and shrill zurnas, was designed to freeze the enemy's blood on the battlefield. This was not an army of nobles, not an army of tribes, not an army of mercenaries. This was an institution, disciplined, loyal, tireless, feared, and its rise would reshape the fate of empires. When the Ottoman army marched into the Balkans, the Christian lords believed they faced yet another steppe warrior force. What they encountered instead was something far more terrifying. At Kosovo, the Janissaries proved their discipline under pressure, while cavalry on both sides clashed chaotically. The Janissaries stood firm, firing volleys with early firearms and crossbows, anchoring the Ottoman line. Their training showed their discipline held, and their performance stunned both ally and enemy. Europe realized something. The Ottomans were no longer just raiders. They were becoming a professional imperial army. Kosovo was not a conquest. It was a warning, and the world ignored it. By the mid-15th century, the Janissaries were no longer an experiment. They were the backbone of a growing empire, and under a young sultan, a boy who had studied Alexander Caesar, and the great conquerors before him, they would be tested in a battle that would echo through the ages. That sultan was Mehmed II. His ambition: to conquer the greatest fortified city on earth. Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire. European observers whispered, impossible. The Theodosian walls had resisted 26 sieges across 1,000 years. Massive, triple-layered, and reinforced by towers. They had defeated Arab caliphs, Bulgarian Tsars, and countless crusading armies. But what those observers did not understand was that Mehmed had something new: a calculating mind, a modern logistical structure, and an elite force specially trained for siege warfare. The Janissaries, a darkened chamber lit by oil lamps, maps stretched across a wooden table. Engineers discuss cannon placement. Logisticians calculate grain and powder. Commanders report troop movements, and at the center, the silent, intense presence of the Janissary Aga, commander of the elite corps. The Janissaries were not merely soldiers. They were planners, engineers, and specialists. They built trenches, dug tunnels, guided artillery, guarded supply lines. Their discipline allowed Mehmed to execute a siege unheard of in medieval warfare. When the massive Lahi, cannons the largest in the world, began thundering against the ancient walls, it was the Janissaries who held the lines, repaired artillery positions, and repelled Byzantine sorties. As days turned into weeks, tension rose, food dwindled, the city trembled. But the defenders remained hopeful, believing that the Ottomans would soon tire. They miscalculated, because Mehmed had yet to unleash his deadliest weapon. On May 29, 1453, under a blood-red dawn, the final attack began. Waves of Ottoman troops surged forward, Azaps, irregulars, and provincial soldiers, each group wearing down the defenders. But the Byzantines still held. And then, the Janissaries stepped forward. Silent at first. No shouting. No chaos. Only synchronized drums echoing across the battlefield. Their advance broke the defenders' rhythm. Their firearms volleys shattered counterattacks. Their discipline held firm even as the walls crumbled around them. Eyewitnesses wrote that the Janissaries climbed over rubble as if ascending a staircase into destiny. When the city fell, it was Janissary soldiers who reached the inner defenses, opened the gates, and secured key districts. Constantinople, the last symbol of the ancient Roman world, was now the capital of an empire that would dominate 3 continents. After 1453, the Janissaries were no longer a secret weapon. They were the pride of the Ottoman military and admired, feared, and envied. Their advantages were clear. While European armies still clung to bows and armored knights, Janissaries refined musket tactics, firing in rotations, maintaining accuracy, and integrating gunpowder into siege and field battles. They lived together, trained together, thought together. This created cohesion Western armies could not replicate. The Ottoman treasury paid them directly. Weapons, uniforms, food, all standardized. They were his personal army, his guard, his political shield. An empire ruled through their discipline. But greatness carries a cost. And the Janissaries were about to become entangled in the very politics they once stood above. Europe still did not understand the Janissaries. Hungary believed its heavy cavalry could break the Ottoman line, just as knights had done for centuries. They assembled one of the largest cavalry forces in Central Europe. Confident, prudent, determined. But confidence is not preparation. At Mohawks, under a storm-filled sky, the Hungarian knights charged. They expected panic. Instead, they saw Janissaries kneeling in ranks, their muskets steady, their cannons prepared, their discipline unshaken. When the Hungarian charge slammed forward, volleys of musket fire tore through armor. Cannons ripped open formations. The Janissaries advanced methodically, pushing back an entire kingdom. In just 2 hours, the medieval Hungarian state collapsed. It became one of the fastest decisive defeats in European history. And slowly, Europe began to realize this was not an ordinary army. This was a military institution engineered for victory. By the 16th century, the Janissaries represented the pinnacle of Ottoman might. They guarded the palace. They enforced the Sultan's will. They commanded respect across the empire. Their barracks became centers of culture, music, and identity. Foreign observers described them as silent thunder, a wall of iron, a brotherhood shaped by discipline and destiny. They were more than soldiers. They were a caste, a tradition, a symbol. But deep inside this greatness, seeds of decay were quietly taking root. For almost 2 centuries, the Janissaries were the backbone of an expanding empire, unmatched in discipline, equipment, and battlefield cohesion. But history teaches a difficult truth. Institutions that rise through discipline often fall when that discipline erodes, and the Janissaries, once forged through hardship, shaped by strict training, and kept loyal through a unique system, began to change. Slowly, quietly, almost invisibly. At first, it happened behind closed doors, within the barracks, in the corridors of power. And then, one day, the world noticed. For centuries, the Janissaries were recruited through devshirme, a levy on Christian boys from the Balkans, chosen for a potential, trained from childhood, shaped into elite soldiers loyal only to the Sultan. But by the late 16th century, this began to break. Powerful officials wanted relatives admitted. Families bribed officers for enrollment. Sons of Janissaries demanded the right to inherit positions. The elite corps that once rejected privilege now embraced it. The Janissaries, once forged through merit, slowly became a political class. Their standards fell. Their training weakened. Their unity fractured. What was once a weapon became an institution. What was once an institution became a levy. And what was once a levy began to dictate the fate of the empire. The Janissaries gained influence far beyond the battlefield. They guarded the palace. They controlled access to the Sultan. They could shape appointments, dismissals, and policy. This power came with consequences if a Sultan displeased them, if reforms threatened them. If a Grand Vizier attempted to restore discipline, the Janissaries revolted. Between the 1600s and 1800s, they overthrew, assassinated, or forced the removal of multiple sultans. What had once been a shield became a blade pointed inward. Ottoman chroniclers recorded some of their rebellions with chilling clarity. The Janissaries set fire to the capital, looting shops, beating officials, and dragging advisors from the palace gates. These were not the disciplined soldiers of Mehmed II's era. These were a political force struggling to hold relevance in a changing world. In Europe, armies transformed rapidly. Line infantry formations became standardized. Drilling systems improved, muskets and bayonets. Advanced artillery became more mobile. Bureaucratized armies replaced feudal levies, but the Janissaries, once pioneers of firearm warfare, refused to adapt. Many rejected new training. Some refused to use modern muskets. Others opposed drilling routines introduced by reformist sultans. The world had moved forward, but the Janissaries were standing still. This clash between innovation and tradition created a widening gap, one the empire could no longer ignore. When Sultan Osman II attempted to reform the army, to restore discipline and build a modern fighting force, the Janissaries revolted. Osman, only 17 years old, was captured, dragged from the palace, imprisoned, and finally killed. This moment broke the illusion of Janissary loyalty forever. Foreign observers wrote, the guardians of the empire had slain their emperor. Within the Ottoman government, fear spread. An institution meant to protect the state had become capable of destroying it. The Ottoman Empire continued to fight wars. Brilliant victories, disastrous defeats. Moments of resilience, and moments of collapse. But underneath it all, the tension between the Janissaries and the need for modernization grew sharper each decade. Napoleon's armies marched with modern doctrine. Russia built a massive, reformed military. Britain industrialized its war machine. Austrians and Prussians created drilled, disciplined armies. The Janissaries, however, had become politically powerful, economically privileged, militarily outdated. They were still fierce, still capable of bravery, still influential. But they were no longer the unstoppable elite corps that stormed Constantinople or defeated European knights on open fields. They were soldiers caught between two worlds, guardians of a fading tradition and obstacles to necessary change. By the early 19th century, Ottoman leaders realized a painful truth. The empire could not survive without a modern army. Russia was pushing south. Austria was expanding its influence. European armies had transformed through drilling, discipline, and engineering. Meanwhile, the Janissaries, once pioneers of battlefield innovation, now rejected almost every attempt at modernization. Sultans came and went. Grand viziers proposed reforms. Military advisors warned of looming disaster. But each time the state attempted to reorganize the army, the Janissaries rose in rebellion. Barracks were set ablaze. Officials were murdered. Reforms were reversed. The empire found itself locked in a tragic paradox. The very force created to protect it was preventing it from adapting to survive. Young, determined, quietly calculating, he understood something his predecessors did not. There would be no future for the empire as long as the Janissaries held uncontrolled political power. Mahmud studied the rebellions of the past. He rebuilt the navy. He strengthened provincial governors. He reorganized the bureaucracy. He quietly formed small, loyal military units, trained in modern European style. And then he waited for the moment when reform was not optional, but unavoidable. That moment came in the summer of 1826. On June 15th, 1826, Mahmud II announced the creation of a new, modern army, trained with European steel discipline. He expected resistance. He prepared for it. Within hours, Janissary units erupted in revolt. Barracks filled with shouting. Drums signaled rebellion. Thousands marched toward the palace. For the Janissaries, this was a familiar script. Intimidate the government, force the Sultan to retreat, abolish the reforms. But this time Mahmud II did not back down. He ordered loyal artillery units, provincial forces, and modern trained soldiers to surround the Janissary barracks. Cannons were positioned, guns loaded, troops ready, and then the command was given. Thunder erupted over Istanbul. Barracks splintered. Flames rose into the sky. The Janissary revolt collapsed within hours. By the next day, the centuries-old elite corps was dissolved by imperial decree. Ottoman chroniclers called it the Auspicious incident. Foreign ambassadors wrote shocked letters home. An institution that shaped the empire's rise was destroyed in a single night, and we thought the Janissaries, once the most feared infantry in the world, came to an end without the Janissaries. The Ottoman state built a new modern army. Western drilling, updated artillery systems, officer academies, standardized uniforms, regimental organization, new training doctrines. But something else emerged as well. A sense of transformation. The empire was finally free to rebuild itself militarily, even if it was late compared to Europe. Behind palace doors, Mahmud II understood the weight of what he had done. He had dismantled a centuries-old institution that once protected the empire and later nearly destroyed it. History would remember the Janissaries not only for their fall, but for the towering legacy of their rise. For 400 years, the Janissaries shaped the fate of 3 continents. Their legacy can be seen in they were among the first armies in the world to integrate gunpowder weapons into disciplined infantry formations. Long before Europe developed permanent armies, the Janissaries were salaried, housed, equipped, and trained. Their bond with their comrades, and the state created one of history's earliest elite military identities. Janissary music influenced European orchestras. Their uniforms, symbols, and traditions inspired military aesthetics for centuries. Their decline became a case study taught by historians, how elite forces fall not through defeat alone, but through privilege, political power, and resistance to modernization. An empty courtyard inside the old Janissary barracks. Sunset over Istanbul. The shadows long, the air still. No drums, no boots, no voices. Just silence, where once the empire's most elite soldiers trained, marched, and lived. Their story is not one of simple rise and fall. It is a story of transformation. How a group of enslaved boys became an unstoppable military machine. How discipline forged a world power. How privilege corroded it. How modernity demanded change. And how history remembers not only their failures, but their greatness. Because the Janissaries were not just soldiers. They were an era. A force. A symbol. And long after their banners were carried for the last time, their shadow still stretches across the pages of history. Strength alone does not make an army powerful. Discipline does. Adaptation does. Unity does. But the greatest lesson is this: no institution, no matter how mighty, is immune to time. When innovation stops, decline begins. And when discipline breaks, greatness fades. Yet, through their rise, dominance, and fall, the Janissaries shaped the fate of nations, and their legacy continues to echo through every modern army that values loyalty, structure, and elite training.